Hi, I'm Ajit Lenin. Welcome to the Enterprise Architecture video series part 8. So we have been looking at the 6-layer framework that I introduced for establishing enterprise architecture practices. So in the previous videos, we looked at the usage layer, evolution, and breadth and depth. And last few videos, we've been looking at the architecture domains layer. And last couple of videos, we were looking at the business architecture. And last video, we looked at business services. And then this video, we will look at the business process. Okay, so let's get started. So we'll look at some of the key characteristics of the business process. The business process basically is a set of business functions, right, performed in an organized fashion to achieve a set of goals, right? So basically, it's a bunch of business functions performed by maybe a same set of actors or different actors, right? But it's a organized set of business functions towards a particular goal. So some of the examples would be shopping, campaign management, offer development, taxing. So there could be a number of anything to do with business. Their business processes can be classified as a business process, and it could be done. It could be an external actor or internal actor who's acting on it, right? And business process can be hierarchical, meaning there could be sub processes and sub processes. So we can break it down to get to the level of the details that the organization want to achieve, right? And businesses process can be related and can be dependent on others. So for example, a quoting process is related to a contract management process, right? So and say an ordering process is actually dependent on the quoting process. Once the quote is produced in a B2B segment, when the quote is produced and approved is when the ordering process starts, right? So there could be dependencies. Enterprise architecture components that participate, that include the business entities or any other components like the process object or the functional object, everything need not be on a stable state. So in the last video, we looked at when we talk about business service, when a service is complete, the business, the architecture components, all the architecture components need to be at a stable state because there is no further action needed. But when you look at the process, that's not needed because it could be the process could be a part of that service offered, right? So for example, when we are looking at a shopping process, right? The shopping process, the end state of a shopping process is a live shopping cart, but that we cannot call it as a stable state of the business because the shopping cart as is not. It needs some action to it, right? It needs to go through a checkout process, and a fulfillment need to be done for a sales service to be completed. So the business service need not, and when we complete a business process, that doesn't mean that it has to be in a stable state, right? There could be in a transition state where some action needs to happen, right? Business process can be performed manually or automated, or sometimes it could be a hybrid process where some of the functions is automated, some of the functions are manual, right? Business process can trigger business functions in parallel. I mean, it need not be always sequential, so there could be parallel paths or could be multiple parallel paths in a business process. Like, for example, if I'm looking at a product lifecycle management, there could be multiple people looking at the product and going through their approval process parallelly. Now, let's look at the types of processes, right? So on a very high level, the processes can be classified into two types of processes. One could be the orchestrated process or the choreographed process, right? So let's look at the orchestrated processes, right? Orchestrated process means there is a centralized process orchestrator which controls the entire process. For example, a BPM tool managing a workflow, right? Basically, the process orchestrator houses the function map. I mean, what function needs to be triggered first, next, etc. The rules governing that, right? The control always, once a business function is performed, the control always comes back to the centralized orchestrator and it initiates, if it needs to initiate another function, it does the initiation, right? And at any point of time, the centralized process orchestrator has the state and the status of the process. We'll come to that. What do I mean by state and the status, right? There's always a confusion on what do you mean by state and what is the status. We'll come to that later in this video. And when we look at choreographed process, right? So there is no centralized orchestrator. Each business function, once it performs its job, triggers an event which somebody else listens onto it and performs a function, right? And then it also generates an event and then goes through a chain of business functions, right? So the key thing is there is no centralized place where the whole flow is controlled. The rules on the for the processes or the choreography happens in each business function, right? So business rules are distributed across each business function. right? And if at all we need to gather the state or a status, right? We need a centralized place where we need to get the state or the status of the process. We need to have a separate tool which keeps gathering the state and status from the different business functions and maintains it, right? So there is an automated process orchestrator to provide that. So now we look at when do we use orchestration versus when do we use choreography, right? So these are typical use cases I have listed out in my based on my thoughts, right? These are the typical scenarios where we go for orchestration versus choreography, right? So let's look at orchestration, right? Orchestration, anything that is very business critical process, that a failure on that process means a significant loss to the business, right? In those scenarios, we typically go with an orchestration where we have full control of the process, right? So we can handle the failures, etc., on the orchestration layer, centralized orchestration layer. Like for typically a checkout process of a retailer, right? Online retailer, the checkout process is a critical process where failure on the checkout means loss of sale, right? So those kinds of things could be will typically go by orchestration. Anything that is very complex, where a distributed rules in across multiple different business functions and modules would means very hard to manage. Those scenarios will typically go with an orchestration layer, right? Another scenario where we go for orchestration is a real-time process. So where we have a business process that is fully automated and real-time, like an API orchestration process, right? When an aggregated API calls based on certain rules, calls different APIs to perform a particular function. Those scenarios is done through orchestration rather than choreography, right? Other scenario is a hard to recover processes. So what I mean by hard to recover is any failure that happens needs basically backtracking the entire process, right? So there may be it may be hard to recover, right? For example, a DevOps process, right? In a DevOps process, the unit testing to the check-in to unit testing to deployment to environment testing, etc. The entire chain, DevOps chain, if any failure happens, very likely we'll basically backtrack the entire thing, go back to the previous, right, before the process started, right? So those kind of scenarios we go for orchestration, right? Now look at some of the typical process scenarios for choreography, right? Anything where we have agile business process, right? The agility, where the agility is more important, right? Where the process keeps changing often, right? Where those scenarios we go for a choreographed process where basically it's more agile because there is no centralized place where the change may be impacting all the business functions that are interacting with this centralized process, right? Whereas I can locally manage my changes with one or two modules, changes in one or two modules, right? Long running, anything that is very long running, like takes days or months to come, weeks or months to complete, those kinds of things, we go with the choreography, right? So for example, an audit process, a compliance audit process goes through cycles, which is weeks or days or weeks, right? So that could be a typical scenario for choreography. Anything that is loosely connected, which kind of has functions across multiple business units, right? It's very hard to create a centralized process which governs, right? Whereas each business unit takes care of their part of the process, right? So those scenarios we go for choreography. For example, an employee onboarding process, right? So that includes actions across HR, payroll, the infrastructure, facilities management, security. So there are multiple business units that's involved in their own business function to be achieved for the onboarding process to happen, right? So those scenarios, that's a typical scenario for choreography. And wherever we think that resource efficiency is more important, right? Then this is a trade-off between criticality versus efficiency, right? So if you think resource efficiency is of high importance, then we go for choreography, where an event-driven architecture enables a better resource efficiency than have a centralized orchestrated process, which has more of point-to-point dependency across the modules, right? And sometimes it need not be a clear-cut orchestration versus choreography. There could be hybrid processes. For a typical scenario would be when we go for a hierarchy, right? So the top level could be an orchestrated process. When we go into sub-process, those sub-process could be choreographed, right? So that's a typical scenario, right? Another hybrid processor on a lot of time we have real-time processes that spins off asynchronous processes, right? So in those scenarios, it becomes hybrid. Top layer real-time component process becomes orchestrated, whereas the sub-process, which is asynchronous, can be or choreographed, right? So we looked at the types of processes where orchestration versus choreography. Now let's look at what is a basic definition between or basic difference between the process and the function, right? When do we classify something as a process, something as a function, right? There's always a my small confusion that is this a function or is a process, right? So to bring in that clarity, I just want to give it some basic definition of a function, right? So, but business function is whenever there's something that is atomic in nature, right? It may be a single step, right? Maybe, or somebody needs to perform 2 or 3 steps or multiple steps to perform that function. But the intermediate steps, right, are very transitionary, right? There is no solid state between these steps, right? It has to be a transient states. It cannot be there in that state. The architecture or the components cannot be in that state for too long, right? So anywhere where these are transient states, like where there is no solid state between the steps in between, it can be classified as a function. Whereas a process between a business function, one function to another function, we still get a solid state. Though it may not be a stable state, it's still a solid state. Another key aspect of it is when we look at business function, it cannot be recovered. It can only be redone, right? Basically, we for a business process, if I have a failure or a jeopardy on some of the business function, I can take another path to recover from that. Whereas in business function, since it is all transient states, there is no in-between state, right? So if something of a failure happens or jeopardy happens, we have to revert back. Right, we have to go back to the starting, right, and then re-execute if you want to do, right. So that's a key difference, right? There is no recovery on the business function, right? And business function typically works on one specific business entity, right? On a business process perspective, it runs over a longer time. It has the solid states in between, and also it can modify or create multiple business entities. So that is some basic classification I wanted to bring in, so that just to avoid the confusion between when do we call something as a business function versus something as a business process. Now let's look at state versus status, right? This is also a typical debate that happens whenever we deal with business processes. What is a state versus what is a status, right? So state, I would define it as something that is defined or derived from the states of the business entities involved in the process. And it is typically used for internal purpose. Right? So the primary purpose of the state is to drive through the path, to derive the path of the process, right? The state transition diagram, which we typically use to represent a process, right? For example, a ticketing process can have created, assigned, fixed, verified, closed, or whatever it could be. That means the business meaning of that business function profile performed should come in the state, so that based on that we can take the next, determine what is the next action, right, internally, right? And states are and these states has to be mapped to the status, right? So we'll come to that. What does mean by status, right? Statuses are typically used for external consumption, right? If an external entity outside of this process, right? It could be another process, right? It could be a business entity which is interested in this process, an external component of the architecture, looking at this process to see if there's any action needed from their side based on the process, right? So that's a typical scenario we use status for, right? It basically gives a view of the process to the outside world, right? For example, the same ticketing process, right, could be the statuses could be not started, in process, completed, or jeopardy, because an external entity is only interested in whether the process is in progress or completed, or is there a jeopardy in it, right? It may not be really interested in what particular status state it is in, right? So that's a basic definition between the state and the status. I mean, there's no clear-cut rule saying that the state cannot be consumed externally, but the primary purpose of the state is for internal consumption. The primary purpose of the status is the external consumption, and the states and status need to be clearly mapped. Right? Now let's look at some of the relationships that involved to the business process. Right. So business process, it can be associated to another business process. We looked at that, and it can be extended or specialized. And then there could be a, inheritance as well, right? There could be an abstract process which can be inherited into more concrete process, or we can extend the concrete process, right? And business process is basically composed of business functions. Business process either uses, creates, or modifies business entities. more than one. It could be any number of business entities. Business process, basically roles participates in multiple roles, one or more roles participate in the business process. Business, and it could be external role or internal role, right? Business process we looked at it, have state as well as status, and business process generates notifications as well as feedbacks, right? So these are, it could be the notification could happen within a function, or as part of, as soon as we complete the function, a notification could go, or a feedback, right? For if somebody initiates a function or performs a function, that could be a feedback going to the person performing that function, right? Now, let's look at on a runtime perspective, right? On a runtime perspective for a process instance, what are the relationships that holds good, right? Process instance, just like process at a process level, it deals with business entities. Process instance deals with entity instances, right? Process instance, I mean, actors, just I mean, role. It is roles on a higher level, conceptual, logical level, roles which participate in a process, and it's the actual actor who belongs to a role participates in the process instance. Process instance have a specific state and a status at any point of time, right? So on a process level, we can have any number of state or status, whereas when you look at a single process instance, at any point of time, it has a single state and a single status, right? An event creates the process instance, and process instance contributes the customer journey. We'll come to this customer journey component in the later videos, but that's becoming in the modern world, it's becoming more and more important to have this journey component into the enterprise architecture. But for this video, we'll just look at saying that process instance contributes to customer journey. We'll look at the details later. With these relationships, let's look at the process model for business process, right? The meta model for business process. So there's on the logical level, business process triggers feedback notification. We looked at that. Roles participate in business process, and business process have a state status map, which basically provides all the state and status and the relationship between them, and it has a function map, which basically provides all the business functions, the guiding rules for that. And the business deals with business entities. And on the same, on a runtime perspective, we have actors, which are instance of the roles, the process instance, which is an instance of the business process, and entity instance, which is the instance of business entity, right? So process instance, uses entity instance is triggered by an event, and actors participate in it. And also the process instance contribute to the customer journey. So that customer journey could be involving multiple processes, right? So we'll come to that in more detail, but a journey could be within a process, or it could be across different processes. Summarizing, we looked at the key characteristics of business process. We looked at orchestration versus choreography. We looked at what is business function and business process. How do we classify that? How we looked at states and statuses. And also business, we looked at the different relationships and then looked at the meta model for that, right? So in the next video, we'll go a little bit deep into the business function and the capabilities, right? Thank you.